Hi everyone, thank you all for joining. This is a webinar from the Global Observatory of Long-Term Care. Specifically, this is the third webinar from the Care and Social Protection in Southern Africa Special Interest Group. Adelina Comas Herrera is the director of the observatory, but unfortunately she isn't able to attend today. My name is Naz, and I work as a research coordinator at the GOLTC, and I will do a quick introduction for the observatory. So the Global Observatory of Long-Term Care is an initiative of the International Long-Term Care Policy Network. The idea behind the observatory is to harness the collaboration that many of us had through LTC COVID and now focus on tackling the wider long-term care challenges. It aims to be a platform for cross-national learning, so to identify key shared challenges and showcase how different countries and localities are addressing them, to share evidence and facilitate collaboration. And this is an area open to anyone interested in long-term care, including policymakers, industry, advocates, care professionals, and academics. Membership of the GOLTC is free, and we currently have 339 members with expertise on over 40 countries. We have 15 active interest groups currently. We also produce long-term care research method guides and blogs. We're establishing associate members, and we're building strong links with the World Health Organization and other international communities. Again, becoming a member is free. I'll be throwing links in the chat during the webinar, as there are many ways to engage with the observatory, including sharing publications, country profiles, and joining special interest groups. In terms of our next events, we have an event on November 19th, which is a webinar from the Quasi-Experimental Methods Interest Group. We also have a webinar on November 25th from the Data Science Interest Group. And on October 29th, we will be having a day-long event to mark the UN's Day of Care and Support. So we're seeking speakers on unmet needs and long-term care, community-based care, workforce, care home of the futures, and quality care. So if you're interested in speaking or have recommendations, please feel free to email us. Now I'll pass it over to the Care and Social Protection in Southern Africa Special Interest Group to begin their webinar.
Thanks, Naz. And thanks everybody for joining us. Hi, my name is Elena Moore. I am a professor at the Department of Sociology, and I run the Family Caregiving of Older Persons in Southern African program. We, with colleagues across the region, have started up this interest group called Care and Social Protection in Southern Africa. And today is our third seminar in the series. I'm very excited about today's seminar. We have eminent scholars talking on the topic of, well, long-term care is family care in Southern Africa, and what are the costs? So we're hoping to explore different dimensions of the costs of family care, and the different ways that access to resources makes care possible, but also the different people that are involved, different constraints, and the way all of this shapes the care experience for different people across the region. So without further ado, I do want to, first of all, thank and introduce the three speakers today. We will start with Professor Lenora Manderson, who's going to talk about mutuality, relatedness, and the pragmatics of home-based care in rural South Africa. I don't think any of our speakers today need any lengthy introductions. They're very well-known, experienced scholars in the area of families, care in the region, on the continent. Our second speaker, Professor Kati Ko, who many of you will obviously know and know well her work, will talk specifically about the return of the daughter. So gendered elder care in Ghana is the title of her presentation. And then finally, we will have one of our own colleagues and researchers, Dr. Nonzuzo Mabukazi, who will talk about the costs of care and rurality in KwaZulu-Natal, a particular province in South Africa. And so I will, without further ado, each speakers will speak for about 20 minutes on to the presentation, and we'll reserve questions and comments and discussions for after that. So first up, we have Professor Lenora Manderson. If I can hand it over to you, Prof. Thanks very much again for agreeing to do this. And I know you've been under time constraints, so I appreciate your participation.
So I really am grateful for the opportunity to participate in this seminar and to talk about the question of family care. The provocation is long-term care is family care in Southern Africa. but it's hard to imagine that long-term care is not family care in the end anywhere in the world. And with the increasing numbers of people who are aging and the general problems associating with institutional care and the aspirations of anybody to age at home for as long as they can, then the best we could ever aspire to anywhere is good enough institutional care. So the question around family caregiving, I think, is critical. The work that I'm doing, I'm going to give a few examples of what I think some of the issues are based on research I and colleagues have been doing in the Agincourt area of northeast South Africa. So if you follow the red arrow, then there's some text in red, and that's where Agincourt is. So it's not that far from Eswatini or Mozambique or Zimbabwe. It's right up in the corner. In an area that used to be a Bantustan called Kazangulu, and therefore was an area that was extremely neglected. The neglect is not so obvious now in some respects when you drive through it, because it's not that far from Kruger National Park, so it gets a lot of intermittent contract work through tourism, and then through commercial agriculture, macadamia nuts and oranges particularly. But it is an area of scarce resources. It's extremely underserved in terms of basic infrastructure such as taps or taps that work, safe water, electricity, but also in terms of health services, and very much here. The nearer to the urban centres one is, the better and more reliable services are, with some exceptions. The study we did was located in one program, and then within that program was nested another study, which is on the slide here, HALSI, which is a longitudinal study of aging in Africa. Within HALSI was our study, and so we sampled 107 people with presumed cognitive problems, presumed to be Alzheimer's, although there was nothing in our own survey work or particularly the ethnography that supported that. But from those 100, we then identified people who they said helped them provide care to someone to whom they were providing care for any reason, including aging and frailty, not necessarily with cognitive problems. So we ended up interviewing over 1,000 caregivers, and then also followed 21 households of South Africans in the area with ethnographic research of constant visiting and interviewing and accompanying them to health clinics and so on. And another study with 13 households of Mozambican origin, where the primary people in the household also were not registered and so didn't even have access to the small amounts of state support available to the others. In all cases, access to healthcare was limited, and these were very poor populations with at least a half not of workers in paid work. And care recipients and care providers, so it's both ways, included spouses. One spouse designated the caregiver of the other, and siblings and parents and grandparents and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. So, and very broadly, so there were like equal numbers of people who were around sort of 30 who were providing care, and people who were under 20 who were school attenders or school leavers who were providing care. The other point that I want to make with that is that where you have people like spouses caring, but also for others who provided care, that often the caregiver was also in poor health and or equally as frail. And in one case, the person who was providing care was in fact the person who did have Alzheimer's, but the person she was caring for, her husband, was the one registered as having Alzheimer's, not through an error, but through changes. So who handles care? Caregivers really do have distinct profiles compared to non-caregivers, most particularly that they're not in employment, but also tend to be of lower education. Were often not married, so it was unmarried or widowed people who were sharing the role of care, and age and gender, although age was very broadly distributed from people over 70 to people under 20, and women more than men, but it didn't preclude men, notwithstanding an ideology of gender. Caregivers, because the area is so poor and caregivers didn't work, then often within a household, the only income was from a social security payment, particularly an old age person's grant, and that money was often widely distributed. So the caregiving, it was always informal, but with support from partners, children, and friends and neighbours and so on. So if people asked who would help you, they were able to name at least 10 people who they said were helpers. But when we went in and looked what they were doing, in fact, the original report of a primary caregiver and the care recipient was not entirely inaccurate, and I'll explain why in a moment. Isolated caregiver care recipient couples were rare. So there was always other people around in some way. And I'll explain that again too. But when they were isolated, they were typically extremely marginalised and vulnerable and impoverished. Caregivers' provision of care rose in terms of the amount of investment in care if they were physically present, and dropped away even if they moved in a different house. Now, I mean, that's obvious. And it is because although surveys capture the idea of care in terms of how many hours do you spend washing this person, toileting them, and feeding them, the reality is that care for older people with cognitive deficits, like care for children, is 24 hours a day. You can't not care just because the person doesn't need a physical act of care at a given moment. Right. So the point of this graph is really to show you the dip, and the dip in this is around the aging of the population, and therefore the increasing need for care. The dip is when South Africa did not have was not able to give free access to HIV medication. This is Thabo Mbeki's period of government, where people were dying consistently at high levels from HIV. And as medication was introduced and systems put in place, then you get an up. So that's there just for your interest. My point is around relatedness, that kin provide more care than non-kin, which is probably not surprising. Non-kin largely are supplementary. There are a few cases of carers who were paid, but they were paid notional amounts of money, and were usually people who needed a bit of support and were unlikely to stay if they didn't have any money at all. Primary caregiver does the most work, and it is because the primary caregiver provides constant emotional and social care. And that includes the care of watching. Now, I've raised the point around household complexity, and often we're talking about really quite big households. So the example I've got on this overhead is a couple where originally the grandmother or the older woman and her husband were the caregiver care recipient unit. The older woman was the caregiver of her husband. But in fact, living in their house, oh no, it wasn't. She wasn't the caregiver. There was a caregiver named, and that caregiver was the granddaughter, a granddaughter. That granddaughter had 3 children. There were 2 other grandchildren by another child, and 2 children of one of those children. So you've got 3 grandchildren and 5 little children, school age and younger, living with a grandmother and a grandfather, with the parents' generation missing because of deaths from HIV and from out-migration, all living off an older person's grant. There was no caregiver grant coming into this household, and that's really the cause of the stress from the grandmother. Okay, so the point, I think, is who provides care, and I do think it's important to think this through, because it's inevitable that care will be tied to individual households. And the point is that there are practical considerations which lead any family to designate any one person. So it's not as if it automatically falls to someone who's in line or who has a particular relationship with the person needing care. It relates to who needs care and who will be at home and why, and if they've got paid work or not, and what might accrue to them as a benefit by providing care. And I've already mentioned the role of government grants, which are very little, but still provide some income into a household to provide support for food and so on. So, but also, there are people who can't get employment. Now, they might not have employment because they can't make arrangements for infant care, because they can't leave their infant with the grandparent who they're providing care for, because they need care too. But also often young people or people in their 20s and 30s with health problems, chronic health problems of their own. And so you've got people whose health is compromised, providing care to other people with serious health problems. The point about all of this, and it relates to the work of care, is the passive nature of caregiving. And I've talked to you, I mean, firstly, the assumption is that women will do this more often than men because it folds in to their ordinary work day of fetching water, washing, cooking, cleaning, and so on. And that active work is going to be there whether or not they're providing care. What providing care to an older person who is frail and dependent does is load onto that workload. So women are more or less doing a double day, and if they've got little children as well, almost a triple day. They are always doing the work of care as well as the work of maintaining the household. And therefore it's largely made invisible. And what we've got here, which Michelle Breer and I have in a paper that's just come out, is the notion of sitting in wait, and they're waiting to be needed, so that in providing care, there are the obvious things that get picked up as activities of daily living and the functional needs that flow from that are captured in any survey about, for example, toileting and bathing and feeding. But some of those things are not even evident unless someone is waiting. And toileting is a very good example, because it's not as if a caregiver thinks, it's midday, it must be toilet time. So it's about watching the person and picking up on signs of distress or concern that might indicate the need to void, for example. Or if they miss that, then there's a lot of washing that's also involved. But at the same time, the sitting in wait is watching that the person doesn't harm themselves, watching if they get distressed and so on. And then making a decision from the part of the caregiver to let some things go. And Michelle and I, and Michelle's ethnography, have some very rich examples of that, where, for example, a person with very marked dementia would be repeatedly washing clothes, hanging them out, taking them off the line, re-washing them, and throwing water all over the place in an area where all water is hand carried to the household. So at the one level, that water is regarded as a precious resource that can't be used. And that the woman who was doing the clothes washing was wasting the water. But there's a decision around, do you let it go? Because the act of washing is calming for the person with dementia. So there's all kinds of tensions in that indirectly add to the workload of the person who's providing care and create emotional tensions between, at times, the caregiver and the care recipient. In addition, this kind of watching and sitting in wait care work is largely invisible, and it's masters doing nothing. And women themselves would say, that they wouldn't be doing anything other than just sitting at home. The point around that, of course, is that they really have no option to do anything else. And where people have had to do things such as go to pick up a grant or buy food or so on, then they've often had to secure the person receiving care, such as locking them in the house or locking them in the house yard, which would, of course, be picked up by others as an example of abuse. And I'll come back to that briefly as I wrap up. Why people take on care includes a shared history of dependence, and associated with that, a shared history of love and mutual care. So people who were brought up by a grandparent, as an example, who need now continuing care, believe and state that they are obliged to care for that person. But at the same time, as I've already said, they often gain from that. They have access to shelter and food and a share of grant money in an environment where they may have work and may have little access or no access to shelter, for example, and may struggle to support themselves. On the other hand, there's a lot of hostility and expectations of people receiving care around who ought to be providing care and why. And I've given on this overhead a couple of examples of women lamenting that their sons hadn't married to provide a caregiver, or that a daughter-in-law had moved to a city with her husband rather than stay and care for parents-in-law. So there is some tensions around the ideologies of care, even though there were relatively few examples of people who honoured that ideology rather than making pragmatic decisions around who would be available. And because it was pragmatic, then oftentimes people had a caregiver and the caregivers would say, I would never leave her. She was everything to me. She was my mother when my mother died. And then 2 months later, she'd gone. And then the other thing is around aging in place. And of course, this is a rhetoric or an idiom that is constantly used around its importance, its social and economic benefits. And it implies that there's choice for people, that one can say, yes, well, I'll age in place and it will all work out. And the reality is, worldwide, people have very little choice. And if, of course, there's no, even if there is an institution, and we do know that institutional care is less than ideal for most people and unaffordable for even more. There are few interventions to reduce the precarity and material deprivations of home environments such as the ones that I've spoken about. And it's the deprivations that make aging in place especially hard for both caregiver and care recipient. Familiarity of place and material items in place, we felt, ground the person who is confused when we're looking at someone who's confused and help manage their agitation. And that was my example of a person repetitively, compulsively washing clothes, which was a role that she'd always played when she was younger. And I think it's important to think, even in places that are materially deficit in some way, that the materials that people have grown up with, whether it's peeling ground nuts or picking mangoes from a tree or washing clothes, are comforting for people who are agitated and need some kind of occupation. And then the gendered nature attachment to homes and to the activities of homes are not insignificant. So for women who are receiving care, their identities are tied to homemaking processes. There were fewer men, but in the end, and men tended to do a lot more passive sitting, but also gardening. Right, so to sum up, and I'm sorry if I've gone over. I've been talking to some extent, at least, about presence and what the presence of a caregiver provides a care recipient. And people with dementia, but also people just with simply extreme, who are extremely frail and aged and or in other ways can't function, engage in familiar tasks in informal settings. And the engagement in familiar tasks is one of the things, of course, that they wouldn't have were they in an institution. But I do want to stress that that's not even possible in terms of, you know, what is ideal and what is affordable. Secondary caregivers cannot lighten a watchful care. So our original theory of having multiple people supporting a primary caregiver and somehow lightening their load was partly an illusion, although some things were really important, and that included visiting, and the presence of others was itself a powerful way of lightening load. I've noted already that acts are sometimes perceived as abusive, but they're often pragmatic. I've talked about access to care, but one little example from one of my PhDs in this study was a woman whose caregiver made drinks to sell, but the caregiver routinely took off her clothes and ran around the yard with pants on her head. And so there was a lot of rather socially uncontrolled behaviour. The only way she could make a living to support them, because she didn't have a grant, so she identity papers, so was not entitled to a grant. The only way she could manage was to lock this woman up while she was working. And you know, it's important to keep in mind those kinds of context and to then question, you know, how one mitigates that or manages it. There are a few systems in place for regular or occasional respite. And there were some in the study area where we were working. There was one group of people who did give home visiting care, who were not health workers. They were community health workers working in conjunction with the community health centre, and that stopped with COVID. They were told not to, and it hasn't picked up. But it does seem to me that the only way one can begin to deal with the heavy weight of care on people to support them through this is to find mechanisms to engage and to provide visiting support and respite in different ways, which is why I've got there at the bottom the potential of involving members of existing institutions such as churches, particularly because in this area of rural South Africa and in most of South Africa, churches, both African Zionist churches and so on, and Pentecostal Christian churches and others are immensely important points in the social webs of individuals. So I'll leave it with that, and I look forward to some discussion about this later. Thank you.
Thanks, Prof. Thanks for the very comprehensive and detailed overview of how all the work is and how the conceptual work is kind of unfolding and presenting itself. I'm going to hand over to Professor Coe. Thanks, Kathy.
Yeah, thank you for that lovely presentation, and thanks for inviting me to this seminar. I'm going to be speaking about elder care in Ghana, so please bear with me. But I also think that this kind of exchange is really important, that what I see in terms of aging studies in Africa is that we get kind of caught into our national silos, and you'll see me guilty of this, that the literature that I'm citing is on aging in Ghana, and I think that there's a lot of room for scholars working across the continent to be sharing their insights and ideas, because I think that there are initiatives around long-term care that may be emerging that we're just not enough in conversation about. So thank you for having me here. So the importance of adult children in long-term care in Ghana is illustrated by a group conversation that I initiated in southern Ghana, in which 3 women in their 60s had the following exchange about anxieties and difficulties of aging, and they were in a rural town. And the first woman said, if you don't have a child, no one is there to care for you. And the second woman, even more depressingly, said, even if you have a child, sometimes your child doesn't look after you. And the third one kind of, again, ramped it up even more, said, even your own child won't look after you. Now, all 3 of these women were then, I mean, at the time of this conversation, looking after someone in the older generation. Relatively unhappily, they complained that other kin had traveled, leaving them to cope on their own. Although they were fulfilling the ideal of kin care, they were thinking about their own aging with these statements. And each cascading statement posited a more depressing scenario, suggesting that they would not be able to rely on their own children for care as they aged, even though they had been dependable, if reluctant, caregivers themselves. Now, many Ghanaians celebrate their reliance on family in providing elder care, contrasting kin care with what they envision in Western countries, the discarding of older adults in institutional facilities. And so elder care becomes a way to organize cultural difference. It inverts global hierarchies such that African tradition has a highly positive valence, unlike in so many other global comparisons. Yet many older adults, like these older women, worry about their care, and various initiatives have popped up recently to provide more institutional forms of care in cases where kin fall through. This includes initiatives from churches as well. And so my work was tracking those initiatives, and I'll present data from that study that took place over about 7 years. Now, government policy also upholds Ghanaian families as the proper site for care of the elderly. Successive governments since the 1990s have explicitly advocated against old age homes. So have influential NGOs like Help Age Ghana, which also has a major hand in shaping government policy. And this approach is based on the advice of sociologists of aging in Ghana who consider old age homes to be antithetical to family traditions as well as too expensive. So, but essentially, I think the old age homes is in a way a red herring. What's important here is that the state constructs its aged policy around a traditional idealized Ghanaian family, highlights the expense and foreignness and inappropriateness of other countries' approaches to the care of their growing aged population. The result of this is that for the elderly themselves, they feel like the state essentially ignores the issues. And Ghana has seen an expansion of social welfare, but it's mainly oriented towards the young and towards making school freer. So those have been important initiatives, but older people feel neglected under this kind of focus on family care. Now, in fact, the obligations of children to care for aging parents have undergone considerable transformation over time. So children of men in matrilineal societies were not obligated to provide them with labor unless they were the children of enslaved wives, and thus second-generation slaves themselves. So Basel Mission documents from the 19th century in the Aquapim area, where I've done most of my research, indicate enslaved daughters of slave wives being coerced to care for their wealthy fathers and their mother's owners by other non-enslaved kin. Now, these cases involved Christians whom the Basel Mission was willing to help in conflictual situations. The care of aging women seems to have resulted in less conflict, maybe because they required less care because of gendered roles in household labor, but the care of aging men was more problematic, and some solved the issue by marrying, and those were non-kin, so they relied on their wives, their slaves, and particularly their enslaved wives and the children of those unions. So I do think, I don't have a lot of evidence for this, but just that in the longue durée, adult children may not have played such an important role as they play today. Now, for the late 20th century, I rely on the work of Isabella Aboderin, who conducted research on 2 generations' expectations of aged care in Accra. And I rely on it in part because it accords with my own somewhat later findings in a rural town in Aquapim. And she found 2 significant changes. One was that care for an older person shifted from a wide array of kin in the matrilineage or patrilineage, including siblings and siblings' children, to the biological children of an older person. This process accompanied what other studies of urban family life found, in which adults began to concentrate their resources on the care of their own children rather than on the children of their siblings. But the main precipitating cause of the shrinkage of responsibility had to do with changes in inheritance law. So the Intestate Succession Law of 1985 made spouses and children the major beneficiaries of the wealth of the deceased. And so because children are privileged over members of the lineage, such as the deceased siblings and their children, children were also given the responsibility of caring for the person before he or she dies. And they take greater responsibility for the funeral arrangements. So a minister in Kwawu asked me rhetorically, why should an older man's family take care of him if they won't inherit? So lineage kin are supposed to be a safety net when children are unable to care for their elderly parents, but they don't always act in this way. So to illustrate the contemporary role of lineage kin, I'll tell the story of Eunice and her father. Eunice was a lecturer at a university, and she explained to me why she placed her father, age 96, in a small nursing home in Accra. And the terrible story tumbled out of her, a situation which remained emotional for her because it was not resolved. Eunice had been living with her father and her brother in her father's house in Accra, but the brother began to mistreat the father and consider the father's house his own. In response, Eunice's father's sister and her daughter took him to live with them in Togo, and these kind of cross-border ties between some groups in Ghana and in Togo are quite common. So Eunice felt during her multiple visits there that they weren't taking good care of him, feeding him but not bathing him, and leaving him locked up in the boys' quarters behind the house. They asked her for money constantly, and his dementia increased, she felt, as a result of their neglect. Eunice had to be wily in taking him away from her paternal aunt's household, and she brought him to the nursing home temporarily for a few weeks while she tried to convince her brother to let her father return to his house. So as her story shows, lineage members will care for an aging relative, but their motivations are increasingly suspect as driven by economic motives. I mean, it's also entirely possible, I didn't speak to them, but it's also possible they may have found the care of someone with dementia more overwhelming than they expected, and that his dementia undermined their own sense of him as a person deserving of care. But essentially, as siblings and their children have been dekinned by the new inheritance law, the relationship becomes sensitive to charges of commodification and a source of tension with adult children. Although in this case, the conflict was precipitated by a son's refusal to care and by his sister's representation of his actions as a desire to take over the house, to control the house, which I know is often a source of intergenerational tension in South Africa. So the second major change that Aboderin notes is that the younger generation tended to make the care of their parents more dependent on the degree of care they'd received from those same parents in proportion to their ability to care, which was taken as a financial measure. So the older generation that Aboderin studied considered themselves to be permanently indebted to their parents for the gift of life, while the younger generation was much more concerned with balanced reciprocity, using the proverb, if your mother or father looks after you while your teeth are coming in, when it comes to the time of his or her teeth falling out, you should look after them. If school fees were not paid, particularly by their fathers, then children might decide to eschew providing care when that father needed help in his old age. Mothers are more likely than fathers to receive care from their adult children because men are constructed in the popular imagination as having many children with many women and not caring for all of them well, whereas women are considered impoverished but sacrificing themselves for their children's well-being. So Jacques van der Heest quotes an older man in the town of Tafo in Kwaú, saying it depends on the sort of life that the sick person led before he got sick. A person who looked after his children very well will never experience neglect. The children will do everything they can to make you comfortable before you die. But if you did not look after them, how will they take care of you when you are sick? So similarly, a daughter in my research talked about how her mother had helped her by taking in her young children for several crucial years while she studied for her teacher's certificate. She'd been working as a teacher, but without a certificate, and therefore was paid a lot less. And so her mother enabled her to do better at work. So grandmother fosterage and child support in the past made her feel obligated to care for her mother after she had a stroke. So as investments in children increased and became normalized over the course of the 20th century, particularly in terms of the number of years of education that children receive, you could say the terms of balanced reciprocity shifted, with children expecting more from their parents than simply care while their teeth were coming in. So we might say that the responsibility of kin care for older adults in the late 20th century in Southern Africa particularly fell on adult children who historically were not always lineage members in matrilineal households. In some sense, they had become kin through the debts they incurred, through the care provided them when they were young. Now, sons and daughters have different roles in elder care. In southern Ghana, adult women, female adolescents, and children of all genders have tended to provide personal care, which has involved living with or near older persons, and I call this the care provider role. Care providers' status vulnerability makes them more easily recruited to such a role, and I think Lenore spoke about that quite eloquently as well. Men, on the other hand, are expected to support their sisters and parents financially and to recruit one of their sisters to live with an aging parent, usually in the hometown, and that requires a migrant daughter to give up her marriage and her income-generating activity to return home. And I call this male role the care manager role. So being a care manager reveals men's power as patrons within their family. So Felicity Olino is noted in Thailand, forms of care emerge in and sustain oppression. So gender intersects with socioeconomic status in that women are likely to be poorer than their male counterparts, and poorer women are recruited as caregivers. So adult women are kind of kin-scripted to fill the care slot, as Jessica Linewaver calls it in her work in Peru. They return to the hometown to care for aging relatives, as well as their grandchildren whose parents are urban migrants. So for some women, this wasn't a problem. Giving up one's marriage in late middle age was welcome, and the hometown functions as a safety net, providing free housing through a lineage or father's house and access to land for growing food crops. For others, returning to the hometown was viewed as forced impoverishment. Migrant siblings and migrant children who had left their children in the hometown household were supposed to be contributing to support the resident caregiver. However, caregivers often complained about their lack of funds and how their siblings and their children were not remitting sufficiently. So what some migrant daughters are therefore doing is hiring a paid caregiver in the hometown to take their place. And in the process, they're taking on the role of their brothers by caring for their parents through providing financial support for their parents' well-being rather than caring directly. And sometimes the paid caregiver is a return migrant to the hometown who's a kin caregiver for her own aging relative and is eager for extra cash. So when I was first introduced to Mary Kwatia at age 55 in Akrapong, the town of Akrapong, she told me she took care of her 77-year-old mother and 2-year-old granddaughter, fitting the portrait of an adult daughter kin-scripted to fill the care slot in the hometown and providing care across the generations. Although her mother walked with a back bent deeply by scoliosis, she seemed capable of taking care of herself as I saw her lighting a charcoal fire and fetching small buckets of water. Latia herself was quite unhappy with the situation, complaining that neither her brothers nor her adult children sent her enough money, and saying she would like to go to Kumasi, a large city, to start a business. When I wondered aloud how Kwetia actually survived on the remittances she said she was receiving, she told me she had also worked as a paid caregiver for older people in the town for the past 7 years. She was currently taking care of a neighbor, a former trader who had had a stroke and lived with her mentally incapacitated middle-aged daughter and adult grandson. The trader's other 2 children, a daughter who taught in a private school in Accra, and a son in the regional capital of Koforidua, sent money to pay Kwetia to bathe and feed both their mother and their disabled sister. The substitution of an adult daughter by a paid caregiver is not seen as stepping away from the obligations of children to care for a parent, but instead a transformation in how kin care is accomplished. Both aging parents and adult children see hiring a care worker as a way adult children fulfill kinship obligations rather than an outright reversal. However, daughters' actions do commodify care by creating a new class of paid caregivers in town and generating class and status divisions through care. So I'll just say that Kwetia complained to me about her treatment from the patient's daughter, Abena. She said that because Abena was paying her wages, Abena never said thank you or gave her gifts, despite being neighbors. The week before, when Abena was staying in the house because her mother was in and out of the hospital, Abena complained that Kwetia treated her mother roughly. Kwetia felt this rebuke was uncalled for when she was doing work that Abena could not do. Other paid caregivers in the town felt degraded by the work and felt kind of ashamed to be doing it in their hometown. They would be willing to do it in the cities, but in the hometown, they felt it was degrading. But Kwetia, in contrast, worked hard to maintain her dignity and to suggest that the wage was not an exchange for her labor, which went above and beyond it precisely because she was doing the work a daughter should be doing. So in conclusion, there have long been tensions about providing elder care. Men and women experience the benefits and obligations of kinship differently. We're not seeing the decline of kin care, but instead slow transformations and negotiations in what's required to meet kinship obligations in providing elder care. The lessening responsibilities of lineage members, siblings, and nieces and nephews for elder care, and the greater mistrust of their care by adult children is connected to their dekinning through funerals and inheritance, making it hard to analyze whether its kinship or kinship obligations have changed. The literature on kinship as processual suggests that it's precisely through these exchanges that one becomes kin, and thus a reversal of kinship obligations would be equivalent to dekinning, and what I've described here supports that contention. Now, the dekinning of some has led to the kinning of others, like adult children. We might consider this an intensification of kinship through kinship's narrowing and its dependence on shifting terms of balanced exchange. This burden particularly falls on daughters. Some daughters have responded to this greater responsibility by finding substitutes for their own labor, by hiring paid caregivers among their parents' neighbors in the hometown. And all of these relationships, including paid caregiving, raise questions about what one is due for caring labor, what kind of care one is obligated to provide, what kind of care one is due on the basis of previous and ongoing exchanges. These negotiations about obligations to care certainly leave older people vulnerable to neglect, and this problem, unfortunately, doesn't seem to be a new phenomenon. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. Okay, we're going to have to run quickly over to my colleague Dr. Nonzuzo Mobakazi. Thanks very much, Prof, for that compelling description. Nonzuzo, don't worry, we will still have the allocated time. I know we're running maybe about 5 minutes behind, but we do have enough time. So take your time and thanks, Nonzuzo.
Sure. Thank you, Lena. Afternoon, everyone. I hope everyone is doing good. This afternoon, I will be presenting on the cost of care in a rural setting. And just to contextualize the title of my presentation, it's Usinda Nonga Twele, which I thought was very important to include. I thought it was very important to include the words, the voices that come from the research participants that I work with. And just to provide a quick background, I'm part of the family caregiving program, and this program is situated in Southern Africa. We are in Malawi, Namibia, South Africa, and Botswana. And in South Africa, we're working in 2 provinces in the Western Cape and also in KwaZulu-Natal. I am situated in KwaZulu-Natal, and the language that majority of the people speak in KwaZulu-Natal is isiZulu. So I thought it was very important to use the words that I have been hearing from the research participants and what we are seeing in the research that we are collecting. Kusinda kwehlela noma kusinda nongathwele speaks to a heavy load, a heavy weight of carrying this work, this burden of providing care, whether it be childcare or care for an older person. And in this particular research, it's the care for older persons that the research participants are saying is a load, is a burden, is very hard for them to bear, and they just have to soldier on with this work to ensure the survival and well-being of the older person. And moving on to the next slide, just to provide a quick overview of what we will be discussing. I will provide an overview of the national statistics in terms of the people who are beneficiaries of the older person grants in South Africa, and then specifically in KwaZulu-Natal as a site of exploration, and the 2 sites that I am working in KwaZulu-Natal, which for the purposes of our research, we have used pseudonyms. It's Miyazani municipality, but of course, this is not the real name of the area. And in this municipality, I am working in a township setting and a rural area. And moving on to the next slide, just to go more into the stats, I will try not to dwell too much into the figures, but this is just to give you an overview of the fact that in the first block, we see the map of South Africa, and we can see that majority of the people receiving the older persons grant are coming from KwaZulu-Natal at 31%. And then when we move over to the second block, we can see that majority of the population that is receiving the older persons grant is Black people at 80%, and we have colored people at 14%, we have white people at 4%, and Indian people at 2%. And majority of the people receiving this grant are in the traditional setting, and 41% is in the urban setting, and 5% is in farm. The block at the bottom just speaks to the fact that, you know, the people that we have been working with in our research are living with conditions, with in some cases extreme conditions such as being disabled and having to manage a disability whilst having high blood pressure and diabetes. So those stats just give you a picture of the conditions that people are living with and the comorbidities as well. And it is also important for us to note the fact that the impact of the care for older persons is very gendered. Majority of the people who are receiving the older person grant are women, and older women are providing care for others as well whilst needing care themselves. So this just paints a picture as to the fact that it is not easy work to be aging in place in the context of KwaZulu-Natal, and also calls us to think about what does aging in place mean when the structures that exist do not allow for individuals to age with dignity as they deserve. And moving on to the next slide, just to be more specific on the municipality that I have been working in Miyazani municipality, we can see that there's a strong spending on NGOs at 695 million. We see that the estimate of provincial revenue and expenditure is also quite strong. There are 37 homes, but for a population of 12.82 million, we need to ask ourselves whether having 37 care homes in KwaZulu-Natal is sufficient. Is it enough? Although we do see that there's a higher number of residential care services and community-based care services as well. And in Miyazane, 13% of the population have no source of income, and this was reflected with the participants that I worked with. The caregivers who were of working age, majority of them spoke about the fact that they were looking for paid work, paid employment, but were not finding employment. And some of them had been looking for work for as long as 15 years. So this just paints the picture of unemployment in South Africa and how this impacts people who are living in a low income setting and who are in dire need for an income, but do not have access to it. And then just to paint a picture in terms of access to electricity, of the 13% of the 18 wards in Miyazane have access to electricity, although this access to electricity is poor, and the participants that I spoke to spoke about the fact that they can experience power outages for up to a week until the municipality is able to respond and resolve whatever the issue is. 77% of areas in Miyazani municipality are traditional areas, 21% is urban areas, and 2% is farm areas. And there's a strong farming of sugarcane in the area. And moving on to the next slide, I will try not to go into too much detail about this slide, for the interest of time, but just to provide you with an overview of the fact that although there is significant detached brick dwelling in both sites, urban and rural, the percentage of the houses that need improvements is quite low. So, and in the rural sites, 10% of the housing is in good condition, and 12% in the urban area is in good condition. And there is a significant amount of houses which need improvement. And just to paint a picture about the access to water in the rural area, there are some areas in this municipality which have access to running water, but the part of the rural settlements that I conducted research in had no access to running water. So people had to collect water either from a river or wait for a water truck to come and deliver water once a week on Thursdays. And in the urban setting, there was a significant access to running water. I didn't encounter any household where there was no running water. And just to move on to the next slide and provide you with an overview of our sample. So our research was conducted in 2 waves. In wave 1, which was last year, we interviewed in Nganyezi rural settlement, which is the rural area. We interviewed 4 care receivers who are male in the rural site and 2 male caregivers and in terms of women, 12 women were care receivers and 15 were caregivers. One particular care receiver in the rural site actually had 3 caregivers, all giving her care, all ensuring that she was well looked after. She was 90 years old, and all of these caregivers were women. So this kind of paints a picture as to how gendered caregiving is in the rural setting. And in moving on to the township, which is Jabula Township, within the same municipality, we interviewed 2 male care receivers and 4 male caregivers, and we had 13 care receivers and 11 caregivers, and in total, with the areas combined, we had a total of 6 care receivers and a total of 6 male caregivers. And in terms of women, we had 25 care receivers and 26 caregivers. And moving on to the next slide, with wave 2, which took place this year, we just for the interest of time, I'll just provide the overview. In the rural settlement, we had 5, and the change in numbers, I think it's very important that I provide some reasoning behind the change in numbers. Some of the research participants had passed away, some of the research participants had moved. I did try to get in contact and try reach the participants who had moved, but it wasn't possible to do this for all of the participants. So this kind of explains why there is a change in numbers. So we had a total of 5 males in Nkanyezi rural settlement, which is the rural site, and 37 women. And in total, there was 2 care receivers who were male and 3 caregivers who were male, and we have 17 care receivers who are female and 20 caregivers who are female. And moving on to the next slide. Thank you, Veda. And I think it's very important that we understand space and what space looks like in the South African setting, and in particular, the setting that I have been working in. And just to provide a background, in South Africa, we have the Native Land Act of 1913, which was basically about the dispossession of land of people of color. We have the Group Areas Act of 1950, and with this act, divided people based on their race, and that meant that people of color were living in areas marked by underservicing, that didn't have quality education, and this is just something that has been inherited in our colonial past and in the apartheid past. And these images give you a picture of what a 4-room house looks like in a township in KwaZulu-Natal, in Sundumbili, in the urban area where I was working. And a lot of the areas had a lot of the participants who I interviewed were living in 4-room houses, and a 4-room house has a toilet outside. And I think the significance of mentioning this is the fact that a participant that I spoke to who was disabled, who used a wheelchair, spoke about the fact that he has, if no one is around to provide him with help to access the toilets, he needs to crawl into the toilet. And he spoke about how this takes away his dignity as a grown man, having to crawl into a toilet due to the fact that he lives alone and his caregiver only comes in during the day between 12 to 4. So this just paints a picture of what housing and house structures have impacted the lives that older persons are able to live in this setting. I have included the picture at the bottom corner just to not to take away the fact that some people living in this area have been able to achieve upward mobility and extend and renovate the 4-room houses, which were inherited from the apartheid government. And moving on to the next slide. Thank you, Veda. This is just an images as to what the site was working in the rural setting looked like. So it is marked by under-service delivery, with garbage not being collected on time. And also, the issue of water is something that a lot of the research participants kept complaining about, the fact that they need to wait for a water truck once a week in order to be able to access water or go to a river, which is not ideal because there's a very small river in the area, which is very far from where a lot of the households are. So this paints a picture as to how difficult this terrain of providing care, whether it be care for the older person or childcare in a rural setting, is. And just to speak to some of the findings. So again, the words that were coming up from the interviews, although our interviews are translated into English, the words that were said by the participants speaking about the strife that they face were kusinda kwehlela, kusinda nonga twele. And it was important for me to bring forward these words. This speaks to this weight that I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation that people in the rural setting carry in providing care. So just to speak about fetching water, the Mhlangu household is one of our households, and we in this household, the caregiver was looking after her mother, who was 90 years old. Her mother had lost mobility and had lost her bowel movements, and she spoke about the importance of having access to water in order to keep the place that her mother was staying in sanitary and ensuring that it was clean and that her mother was clean and well looked after. And she also spoke about the fact that when family members or neighbors came to visit, she would be the person who would be looked at as not looking after her mother adequately if she did not prioritize this. And I think what was so poignant in this household is the fact that the caregiver was 65 years old, and she herself spoke about the fact that I am living with high blood pressure. I have care needs myself, but I need to prioritize my mother. I need to ensure that my mother has everything that she needs. And water was something that she spoke about as a difficulty for her as an older person who is not as fit and mobile to be able to go to a river and collect water. She had to make use of the water truck, which was not always consistent. And in terms of poor road infrastructure in the area, so the area that I worked in had gravel roads. There were no tar roads. So a lot of the participants that I interviewed spoke about the fact that they needed access to tarred roads in order to be able to access ambulances in cases of emergency. And an example of this is the Mdimande household, where we conducted research. The care receiver was battling with a lung condition, and this lung condition would often flare up, meaning that the caregiver would have to call an ambulance, and an ambulance would have to come and provide care and assistance to the mother. The ambulance they lived at the bottom of a valley, and the ambulance had gone to the household twice, but broke down due to the poor terrain of the area. And I mentioned this to speak to the fact that having poor infrastructure, poor road infrastructure in this case, has consequences for how people are able to access care and how care can be provided for older persons. The care receiver in this household has since passed away from those lung complications, which was something that was very somber and sad to discover when I went back in wave 2. And there was also a lack of medical supplies, and I had the opportunity to speak to social workers who work in this area, 2 of the social workers who work in this area, and the community health worker who works in this area. And what was the takeaway for me from interviewing them was the fact that they were stretched thin. They felt that they couldn't cope with the number of people that they had to service, and they were stretched thin by the fact that there wasn't much the departments, the departments of social development, the department of health were not responding to the care needs of this area, which often made them look as if they do not care about the needs of the people, the needs of the care older persons. But it was just the fact that the department was not being responsive to what the care needs are. And food security as well. I think it's very important that I speak to this, because the community health worker that I spoke to spoke about the fact that a concern for her was the fact that a lot of the people that she interacts with, the patients is the word that she used. A lot of the patients do not have access to food because there's such food insecurity in the rural area. And she had been writing to the Department of Social Development to ensure that they at least get food parcels per week. But this is something that there wasn't a response to. And the impact of not having food or sufficient food is the fact that it affects how these patients are able to take their medication. And this just speaks again to the poverty and the cost of providing care in a rural setting. Just in summary, in terms of our main findings, is the fact that access to healthcare is problematic due to the distance of the health facilities from where the participants were staying. We have spoken about the politics of space and how difficult space is in this area. And there are long waiting times at the clinics, at the health facilities, and at SASA, which is an organization that our participants often have to access. It's an issue for older persons because they have care needs, and waiting a whole day just to be seen by a doctor or a nurse to attend to you is something that is work for them. And in terms of living arrangements in the rural setting were often poor, and not every older person had someone living in the house with them. Some older persons had to wait for care, did not have a person living in the house with them, which meant that they had to wait until the morning for the person providing care for them to come in and be able to support them in whatever way they needed. And transportation barriers. I have included some figures in terms of what amounts to take a taxi to go to town, take a taxi to go to the clinic look like, and they may seem like small amounts, but these are not small amounts for families that are stretched thin, for families where poverty is a reality too, because this amount of money could be a money that can be used for a loaf of bread or to buy a tin of fish, or whatever need is needed in the household. And just to speak to this household, okay, you have a caregiver who is 34 and not employed. And she spoke about the fact that she was actively looking for work, and the fact that she was frustrated by the fact she was not finding work, and she was looking after her mother, whilst looking after her mother, also providing care to 9 children who were in the household. And she spoke about the difficulties of managing this work, but a priority for her was finding paid employment. Even her mother spoke about the fact that she was constantly struggling, and the fact that as a family they were constantly struggling. But for her, the main thing would be for her daughter to find a job. So this speaks to the need for the recognition of care, and how care provision can be overlooked when people are faced with the financial difficulties, and finding paid work as more important than unpaid care work, which is essential and is the lifeline of a lot of families in the rural setting and in broader settings as well, especially in the low income setting, where people cannot afford to outsource care, cannot afford to hire paid caregivers, and have to do the work of providing care themselves. Thank you, Elena.
Thanks, Doc. Thanks, Nonzuza, for providing that oversight and the detail at the, at each level. Okay, so we have just under 15 minutes now for discussion and questions. I'm going to open it up to everybody in the room as such. If you want to either raise your hand or pop a question into the chat room, that feel free to either of the speakers or all of the speakers. I want to thank again, obviously, the speakers for their presentations. I'm going to give it just a few seconds to see if we have any specific questions. Are there any hands up, any burning questions from anyone first?
First, thank you very much to all the three presenters. It was really thought-provoking presentations that we had, and it really speaks to the situation of care of older persons. The first question to the first presenter on the care of the Mozambique, Southern African Mozambique study. I've seen that it was on people, care for people with dementia, Alzheimer. My question was just that it's quite a big sample that was covered in the study, and the question was just how was these participants, the ones who need care, identified or diagnosed, because I do believe it can be a challenge in our context. I'm from Namibia. In our context, to get people suffering from dementia, Alzheimer, diagnosed. So I wanted to know, it's a big sample. I wanted to understand how you were able to identify those participants, the care recipients who suffers from dementia, Alzheimer. And then I wanted to ask the question to the second presenter, or just a comment on the matrilineal, the lineages of relatedness in African communities. And where you mentioned that the matrilineal relatedness may also hamper people seeing the responsibility of providing care. And I just wanted to share that in the Namibian context, where we have quite a diverse population, in some communities where there is the matrilineal relatedness, it can also be a factor how people might not be motivated to provide care for older person who is related to them according to the matrilineal line and not the patrilineal line. Thank you.
The original recruitment of people who were identified as at risk of Alzheimer's, and it was based on clinical interviews primarily. But as I think I mentioned, that sample is a subset of a population that has now for 32 years been participated in a household census every year. So there's solid clinical data for many of those people. It's a very large demographic and health surveillance site. We sampled from a subset of the dementia study, and some of those people, not from our survey sample not necessarily, but from others, have now been had MRIs in Mbombela, which is the capital of the province in which we're working. But we did not find anywhere near the number of people with signs of Alzheimer's through our household surveys or as a result of in the ethnographic research. And what we find is vast discrepancy between who is reported to have a condition and who shows signs of actually having the condition, who finds it difficult to, well, has memory problems, doesn't know where they are, and so on. However, that did not negate the need for many people to have care. And what stood out was that some people who had been reported at risk of Alzheimer's disease, which is a very specific diagnosis, didn't have that, but they had diabetes, they had cardiovascular disease, they had arthritis, and they had other problems. And intermittently, if they had an infection, they certainly would then have some kind of delirium, which might occur with people, for example, with urinary tract infections. And so at any given point, a person who was receiving care needed major intervention for care, and at other times they were reliant on support for some other reason. And I'm wary of claiming, many people had Alzheimer's. The people that we felt were definitely had cognitive deficits were people who really had very little awareness of their surrounds and didn't. I mean, a woman who said her husband was down the street and he died, in fact, 20 years ago, but also his graveyard was right outside her front door. And at one point she said, oh, that's where he's buried. So it wasn't, you get those sort of lapses and moments of remembering with major deficit in that way. So that's the background to it. And I think more importantly is that regardless of the diagnosis, the work of care, as has just been described for KwaZulu-Natal, doesn't change, and you've got people living in very impoverished circumstances. So I'll let Catty answer the question to her.
Yeah, thank you for that point. And I think that what's in a way so striking for me is that these shifts in reciprocities and in kinship, that they set up the possibility for many people to, in a sense, say they have no obligation to provide care. So from the perspective of children, to say, no, my parent didn't care for me, or from the perspective of the matrilineal kin, to say, no, I'm not, I could do something if I wanted to, but I'm not obligated to because I don't have any, I won't inherit, or there's no obligation to be part of this. And so that there's, and then, or if the person who other people feel is most obligated isn't providing care, then other people also won't step in. So there's and yet there are these people who are doing kind of extraordinary things regardless. And so that's what's quite striking to me is just how complicated caregiving is, and how many people there are who are also trying to recruit others to care, and how that also means that the most vulnerable are getting into that position of providing care because they are the ones who respond to the promise of free housing, of I will send you remittances, I will send you something each month in exchange, which then may not in fact happen. And then there can be resentment that then sometimes gets taken out on the person who's cared for, because people need to seek work in other ways, and then that results in neglect. So I think it's a really complicated thing, anyway, and pragmatically and politically, it's hard to figure out, well, do we think of the caregivers as sacrificing themselves, right? Or do we explore some of these tensions, that then there's an intervention that that the state might be able to become more involved with, in a sense.
Thanks, Prof, for that point. I see there's a question for Nonzuzo. Nonzuzo, I'm not sure if you've seen it, but I can read it out. You're asked, what is your base or rationality to select your sample? And do you think that your sample is representative?
The rationality behind my sampling is the fact that KwaZulu-Natal, 70% of KwaZulu-Natal is rural land. So I think that there is quite richness there in terms of understanding what a rural setting looks like, and the takeaways that we can get in terms of what providing care for an older person looks like in a rural setting. And just to provide more context, is the fact that my grandmother is from this area. She has passed away, but she had been born and raised in this area, so it's an area that I'm very well familiar with, and I have understood the strife that goes on in terms of providing care for an older person in such a setting with no running water and poor road infrastructure.
Thanks, Nzuzo. And just to point out, I mean, and I think it's of interest, I think it was raised earlier, this kind of comparative, review or understanding of what's happening, not just across countries on the continent or in the region, but also within the country. So having, an understanding of what's happening in a rural area in KwaZulu-Natal versus a rural area in Eastern Cape. And we see that through the various resources that are at the state level that are being offered, but to then explore how that then impacts folks on the ground is really, really important. There is a real, and Lenora, I'll point this towards your work as well. There is a grave danger and a very political important role that we play as researchers in this area, right? And we know that African traditions, in terms of expectations of family to care, are rife. They're rife within our policy documents. They're you can see them everywhere. They're being used in speeches. They're being used all the time. It has authority, and it has sway amongst different range of stakeholders. And so when we think of I think we have to be careful with our sampling as well. Whilst none of us are engaged in heavy national, representative samples, we do need to see that the range of caregiving practices that are out there for differently placed people. Because I know, Nora, you did mention at the start, you talked about the distinct profiles of caregivers compared to non-caregivers, right? But again, if you were to compare caregivers in Nonzuzo's side, for example, in rural KZN versus many of our other sites in the Western Cape, they're radically different. The number of, young children or younger adults providing care is much less. The size of the households, so even just the basic stuff is much different. So I am curious to hear one kind of comment from each of you about the political work involved in the types of things that we're talking about today, and the importance of our contributions in that regard. Perhaps, Lenora, you can go first.
Yeah, I mean, I think the political work is firstly undoing an assumption that there is an African family.
Yeah.
And if I hear one more person say Africans do X and Africans do Y, as if the whole continent's a country and everybody on the continent has the same value system and the same capacities. And in the area where I work, 25% of people are of Mozambican origin, and the large number of those people don't have ID papers, nor do their children or their grandchildren, because they've never been registered since settling in the country during the Civil War. But I also think, there are clear differences between the resources that people have, where there's money now being remitted back to rural areas, but there are also, of course, challenges in urban areas, and there is a large urban poor growing in this country who also have those kind of dilemmas, and people trying to remit money back. And it would be really helpful, I think, to begin to think strategically about the way in which one deals with caregiving, given that people certainly wish to be in their own home, regardless of the challenges, including tensions with our own households. And relating to that, of course, it's important to not assume that all families are happy families, and that all people are safe in families, and that all elderly people are safe and loved because they're elderly people. So this is such an important seminar to begin to open up some of these questions.
Thanks. Nonzuzo and then Kati?
I think for me, Lena, it's the importance of amplifying the voices of older persons themselves and the people providing care for them. People in the rural area, the participants in the rural area spoke about the fact that they feel as they are forgotten people. They feel unseen. Forgotten people is what kept coming up. So I think that there's a need to prioritize the rural setting, which is often overlooked in the South African setting. And I think there's also a need for us to realize the dangers of as you always say, pushing care into the family. The state needs to come to the table in terms of how we can envision care for older persons beyond just grant transfers.
Thanks, Nzuzo.
I think I will just repeat what Lenore and Nzuzu have said, which is just basically that I think many African states have, in a sense, abrogated their responsibility for older adults by having an idealization of what kin care looks like. And there are many, many things that they could be doing to make kin care easier and actually more able to be done with less conflict. And so I think pointing out those kinds of things is one aspect of our work.
Okay. On that note, Naz, I know we went 3 minutes over, and I apologize for that. I thought it was an important conversation. I know we could continue to go over. I want to thank our 3 speakers for their time and their efforts and their insights. And thank Naz for the GOLTC for allowing us to come together. And thank to all our, everyone, or the participants who were here today. Thanks, everybody.